Hi, Carl Ford here again, talking about the Super Wi-Fi conference with our esteemed colleagues, Steve Coran from Coran and Barlow from Keener Law Group. Yes, two lawyers who actually are going to talk about substance and not just, well, never mind. Anyway, gentlemen, I'm excited about this content that we have here, and we're now talking about incentive auctions. Tell me exactly how incentive auctions are going to work and who's going to benefit from them.
Hi, Carl. Steve Coran here. The answer to your question is I wish we knew, but we've got some great people on a panel that will help us figure out who the competing interests are and whether these interests are truly competing or whether they create opportunities for partnerships. So our session begins at 1 o'clock right after lunch. First panel is called Incentive Auctions, Looming Battles or Burgeoning Partnerships, and we'll have, in addition to Barlow Keener, and we have Aparna Sridhar from Google, and a couple of other analysts from the investment community. Marty Stern will be moderating the panel, and anybody who's been at one of Marty's sessions know that he draws out a lot of terrific information so we can begin to see who is versus who and who is with whom. So I think this will be a really cool follow-up to the session the earlier day about what's going on with incentive auctions and kind of the regulatory aspects, and this one will get into where the various alliances are and who's going to be teaming up and where the business opportunities will result. Following that, Rich Shockey will be giving us a roundup on the geolocation database with our two confirmed database administrators, Telcordia, represented by John Malyar, and Spectrum Bridge, represented by Rod Deere. We may also have some others, but again, as we talk about databases, we talk about the basic services that these companies will be offering, as well as added value services, and also what some of the issues are, perhaps in other bands, that these databases will translate to. So I'm looking forward to this one as well, mostly so we can see not just where databases are, but where they're going in some of the other bands and what some of the other value adds are. Before we get to the late afternoon keynotes on Thursday, we will have a final panel called White Spaces, Emerging Business Models. Examples are M2M, indoor TV, and backhaul. Here we get away from the personal portable products that Google and Microsoft and others have been championing, as well as the fixed wireless broadband products that wireless ISPs and others have been championing, and looking at other sort of vertical markets. So we'll be happily joined by Darren Milet of Adaptrum, Rick Rotundo of XG Networks, Robert Wu of Six Harmonics, and Luke Darcy of Newell. So all experienced speakers who have given a lot of thought to where the markets are headed, and looking forward to hearing what they have to say.
Yeah,
cool.
That's going to be interesting because those two kind of tie in together, mainly because we're going to get to another topic, PCAST, where both the white spaces models and also the database models can be used in other spectrum besides the 700 megahertz.
So go ahead and talk about the PCAST session right now. We'll go out of order for just this moment here.
Well, I wanted to also say that we're going to PCAST is a President's Council Advisory Council on Spectrum, and what they've recommended, this is a tremendous report that has been put together, led by Mark Gorenberg and Craig Mundy at Microsoft and Eric Schmidt, to free up 1,000 megahertz of federal spectrum that's underused is the right word, and apply some of the white spaces model, the database model, to that unused spectrum. So we have this huge opportunity there, and we've got they had a report that they put out, which they delivered to the president in August or in July, late July, and we've got some of the folks from that report who put that report together, the worker bees. There was a lot of folks involved other than the head folks, and they're important also. Vanu Bose from Vanu will be one of those report members, will be speaking. Preston Marshall will be speaking, and Preston is, I don't know, I don't want to call him, I don't want to say he's one of the early innovators of white spaces. and Mark McHenry at Shared Spectrum Company, CTO there, who has been sort of a proponent of sensing. So that means your radio senses whether someone else is using the particular spectrum as opposed to the database telling you. So it's a unique group. These guys know the area better than anyone else, and we could see by the time of the conference an executive order from the president telling the agencies, we're going to implement PCAST, and you need to begin to look at the spectrum that you can give up. So that in itself will be huge if it happens, and it could happen by the time of the conference. So
let's go to that last session right after that then, and let me ask you both a question. And given the fact that I've got your eye contact, I can tell whether or not it's going to be true or not. Can we balance the budget by selling off the spectrum?
Well, that's not part of PCAST. That's more has to do with the TV auction, and the answer there is that. Just a minute. I had an interference here.
Yeah, I don't want to say anything, but your white space got crowded there. Someone shared the spectrum with you.
Yes, someone shared the TV, right.
So anyway, back to the subject at hand. Let's try that again. We'll throw this out. We'll end it. We'll end it on the discussion about the PCAST stuff. But
okay,
you'll have to edit that one. Sorry, Matt. So here we are again. We're talking about the Super Wi-Fi event, and before we get much further, I got intrigued here, and you're telling me that I'm wrong. But if you're sitting there talking about PCAST, and there's, what did you say, 100 megabits of spectrum available? How much spectrum is available?
1,000 megahertz.
1,000 megahertz. Does that mean that we can balance
spectrum, like radar and that sort of thing?
So are we going to be able to balance the budget by selling off the spectrum again? I mean, I don't want to say anything, but LTE is a little crazy. I mean, we've got spectrum.
There's some of the PCAST report recommends selling, some of the spectrum for exclusive licenses. There's a big argument about exclusive licenses, like the cell phone companies have, and a non-exclusive white spaces. Steve, you want to pitch in on that? I mean,
yeah. I don't think that PCAST was designed to balance the budget. I'm not aware of any president that will do that, and I think once we get past the conventions, we'll have a better idea of where each political party stands on balancing the budget. But there was in the spectrum legislation an objective to pay for the payroll tax extension with spectrum proceeds, and that's going to be from the license portion that's going to be reallocated for the broadcasters. So the notion with the unlicensed spectrum is the creation of consumer welfare, it's innovation, it's driving broadband adoption and accessibility and broadband literacy. So these are elements that are difficult to quantify and probably don't go into a budget, which means they're kind of hard to get from Capitol Hill, but we're happy we are where we are, and now we're down to dealing with it at the FCC.
Yeah, so the TV, Carl, in numbers, the TV auction is supposed to deliver about $3 billion back to the Treasury, which was the number that was plugged for the D block. So
okay.
That's the particulars.
So given the fact that I'm showing my lack of education, let's go over to the discussion of AirU and what Blair's doing. Okay, and first of all, kudos to you, Barlow, for getting Blair, and also kudos for getting Stacy Higginbottom. So we've got Gig U and Gig Ohm, but in this session. You want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, so Blair, who ran and put together the National Broadband Plan, and Gig.U, is going to be our keynote speaker. And Stacy, who's at Gig Ohm, she will be interviewing him. So, Stacy knows this white spaces better than any reporter out there. And then Bob Nichols is also most likely going to join us. He's the Air.U founder. and Air.U and Gig.U got together, and they've had some announcements where they're going to use white spaces, in particular white spaces radios, in rural settings, rural university settings, to give those towns the same kind of bandwidth, you know, for the professors and the students and the staff that any non-rural town would have. That's kind of the goal. And Bob has made great inroads, and Blair has really been promoting Gig.U, and with some very big success. So we're really excited about having both of those speakers here.
Excellent, excellent.
Steve?
No, I think it's great. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Blair and hearing from Stacy, and I think this will be interesting to see where the National Broadband Plan started and ended, and where the implementation is taking it, and whether we're deviating from the plan or expanding on the plan or sticking true to it, and how far along we are in implementing the plan. So it should be very interesting. That and the PCAST discussion should make for a very entertaining, high-level policy point of view that everybody should appreciate as they evaluate investment opportunities and use cases.
Excellent.
Yeah. Also, Carl, I wanted to mention one other thing. We've got Mark Gorenberg at Hummer Windblad, who is the chair of the PCAST report, who's going to be speaking to us. So, you know, he was on the same committee with Eric Schmidt and Craig Mundy at Microsoft. So he's very excited about this whole concept of spectrum sharing, database, and white spaces.
Cool, cool. So I'm looking forward to this, and I thank you guys for this. We're going to have one more session about the sessions, and it's going to be the Friday discussion, so I'm sure we're going to lose some people right now just at the fact that nothing happens on Friday. But we've got some great content here that we want to talk about, so please join us on the next flip over. Ready? So welcome again, folks. This is Carl Ford talking about Super Wi-Fi, October 3rd through 5th, with my friend Barlow Keener from Keener Law Group and Steve Coran from Rini Coran. Yes, they are lawyers, and they are making no apologies about that. And we're talking about the Friday content. And as always, Friday has the wonderful role of making sure that we talk about the practical side of life and what's really happening. So first of all, I like the name Hurts So Good. Tell me about that session.
Thanks, Carl. Steve Coran here. Hurts So Good, new bands for spectrum sharing. This will be an extension of some of the other things we will have teed up on Wednesday and Thursday, but again, we'll be talking pretty specifically about a number of bands that the FCC will put in play for mobile and fixed wireless use. Most of it is going to be spectrum that has to be shared, and a lot of different ways you can share spectrum, through a database, through variable power, through preemption, through other forms of dynamic spectrum access. So
hold on. We got to bring Barlow back in.
Do we
back into Hurts So Good?
All right, I just want to say, tell me when we start, because I'm going to lead into the Hurts So Good, and then let Steve take it.
Okay, that's fine. So I'll start with you, Barlow, then.
Okay.
Ready? Hi, Carl Ford here, talking about Super Wi-Fi, October 3 to 5, with my friends, Steve Coran from Rini Coran and Barlow Keener from Keener Law Group. And Barlow, you know, Friday's normally a rough day for people, but it's also the day where we get practical. Talk to me a little bit about setting up Friday for us.
Well, it's rough because TMCnet has this big party the night before, which some people, I don't go to it, but a lot of people go to it. And so people are tired in the morning, but and with that in mind, Steve came up with this title, which we think is fantastic, Hurts So Good. So, Steve, why don't you tell us what it's about?
Thanks, Barlow. Steve Coran here. The good thing is that Friday morning we don't start until 10 a.m., so anybody who's going to the TMC party will have plenty of time to make it out of bed and check out our first session of the day called Hurts So Good, New Bands for Spectrum Sharing. And we'll be talking very specifically about a number of bands that the FCC is putting in play on a shared basis. various forms of dynamic spectrum access, which are ways that spectrum can be shared, whether it's a database or variable power or preemption or spectrum sensing. There are a lot of different ways and a lot of different solutions for each particular band. No one size fits all. We're going to have to pick the best technique that works for a particular set of incumbent users and the particular set of expected new users. So this should be a great session. We've got Paul Garnett from Microsoft and Hank Hultquist from AT&T, along with Preston Marshall. So I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot of these different techniques and maybe even coming up with some tentative conclusions about which ones work best in which bands. So stay tuned for that. Following that, we're going to talk about the WISP perspective, why wireless internet service providers like TV whitespace. What is so special about TV whitespace that makes it so conducive to deploying fixed broadband service? So we'll be listening to a number of wireless ISPs that operate primarily in rural areas, and they can tell you why the propagation benefits are great, what the cost points are, and whether it makes sense to deploy TV whitespaces everywhere you can, or if other spectrum solutions are better, and what kind of problems we're trying to overcome, whether it's tower access, access to infrastructure, or various other things. Bob Nichols from Air.U will be joining us and talking a little bit more about the project that is being put together among a consortium of public interest and wireless interest to use TV whitespaces to deploy broadband on college campuses. So looking forward to that. Our final panel of the day, we're just calling Crystal Ball, Whitespaces in 2018. Where are we going to be 5 years from now, 6 years from now, when and what are the predictions we have from our various experts on how white spaces will be used, where they're going to be used, whether it's a global phenomenon or a local one. And I think all of us will want to hear what our experts have to say. So that's it. That's how we will wind up shortly before 1 o'clock, and then folks can enjoy the sights and sounds of Austin or head back home with a lot of great content and new ideas.
Or try to win the car.
And some barbecue.
Right. Now, we've gone through the entire show, but the truth of the matter is that we've not mentioned two names, one of them being Heikki from Finland, and they inadvertently got lost on the schedule, and they're getting re-put in now. And Jim Carlson's kind of missing, which is hysterical, because Jim's basically been like one of our major players. So can we just talk a little bit about the fact that we've got kind of a global perspective here, guys, and the fact that when we're talking about the crystal ball, it's not just U.S.?
Oh, yeah, no, the global perspective is big. Ofcom in the UK has implemented, actually, they're kind of out, I don't want to say it as a put down to the FCC, but Ofcom has made a lot of good progress in getting white spaces off the ground in the UK. And we've got some big companies that have been, small companies over here, including Carlson Wireless and Adaptrum have gone over. Microsoft have gone over to the UK to help, I guess, plant the seeds. And so Spectrum Bridge has been a very big proponent, and Google, and so overseas. And so we expect to see both the radios and the databases starting to be sold overseas. And here we've got Newell, for example, coming over. They're based in the UK, and Six Harmonics has done a lot of work in China. So what we've got is the seed is really the small plant that we've got. It's grown of all the industry players worldwide really making white spaces happen. And you know, with the PCAST model kind of getting a lot of high profile, Steve, don't you think?
Absolutely.
It's going to make a quantum shift.
Okay, great. So this concludes the discussion about the conference side of the equation. I'm going to do one last session with you guys where I get to ask stupid questions and you guys can give me smart answers. So stay tuned, folks, and learn what we're going to discover. Ready? So welcome, folks. We're talking about Super Wi-Fi. We're not going to talk about the conference per se right now because I'm going to ask these guys some general questions because I'm confused about the mobile industry in general and I'm looking for their guidance. So first of all, let me tell you who I've got as my panel here of experts. Steve Coran from Coran and Barlow Keener from Keener Law Group. Both of you gentlemen have been dealing with TV white space in a big way, but you've been dealing with Spectrum in general and the telecom industry overall. So I've got some questions that I'd like to ask you guys. So, is the TV white space spectrum going to make it so that Wi-Fi has competition from another unlicensed spectrum, or is it complementary, or is it totally different marketplaces?
I'll take this one. The answer is yes. In some places, you may see competition with Wi-Fi. In other places, you may see bundling of services, both Wi-Fi and a more robust broadband solution. You may see mobility. You may see a lot of different things. You may see M2M on white spaces in some places, and traditional data, person to person or person to device or device to device on other parts. So I don't think there's going to be any one business model that's going to emerge. I could be wrong, but I think depending on where the spectrum is and depending on where the innovation takes place and where the demand is, at the intersection of those points is where you're going to see the business model develop in a particular area.
Yeah,
Barlow,
if anything, I'll just jump on that. What's that? I'll just jump on and say, if anything, the white spaces contention-based algorithms and chipsets are going to probably help dramatically lower the prices of the white spaces CPE devices. That's what kind of I've been hearing. So because white spaces is unlicensed.
So here's my next insane question for you both. LTE is not like GSM. As we do 4G, we're getting private spectrum rollouts on LTE. So it's not like when you sit there and you've got one universal phone, like in Europe, and you can choose which operator goes on there because of the fact that they're all on the same band. Mm-hmm. So are we going to see an opportunity for the unlicensed spectrum to become kind of a service provider focused for a shared-like experience? So in effect, we'll get GSM-like activity going on within the TV white space community. Is that a possibility?
Well, this is beyond speculation, but I've got my 2 cents on that, and Steve, jump in. But I think that we could, and I know some of the larger service providers out there, and I don't mean cellcos, but ones that serve the cellcos, they're very interested in looking at white spaces and see potential for even what you could say backhaul for the towers or micro towers, sort of a hybrid approach. And you may see some of that spectrum. I mean, I think, Carl, this is what you're asking, some of the unlicensed spectrum being used by LTE. Steve?
Agreed. No question about it. The cell companies are offloading a lot of their data onto Wi-Fi networks. There's no reason to think that they would not do the same on white space networks if they can get better propagation or have more spectrum, or if it's cheaper to do.
Well, that gets me to that last...
Even, Carl, I just want to jump in. I know PCS, I think it's Metro PCS, I think that's the company. Their handsets are right down there next to the 700 megahertz that white spaces is using. So, you know, it's not that far away in terms of equipment.
Cool. So that brings me to the other side of the equation, because, you know, we've went into femtocells and picocells, and now we just talk in terms of small cells. And in terms of propagation and range, it feels to me like TV white space kind of fits nicely into what they're trying to accomplish with the small cells. Am I wrong in that analysis, or, you know, do I need to go talk to RF architects? But it feels that way to me.
I think it's a little bit different because you're not reusing the frequencies that often, because it propagates better. So it actually works better just from purely a spectrum perspective on a wide area rural type play or on a backhaul play. Small cells work where you want a more denser deployment, like in a shopping mall or a college campus, and you want to have, you know, a ubiquitous footprint with a lot of spectrum that you can reuse over a short period of time, because you need more spectrum in a smaller place as opposed to less spectrum over a bigger place.
Yeah, I think that, Steve, sort of adding to that, I don't know what happened to picocells and femtocells. You know, I was a big proponent. I thought they would take off, and, you know, to some extent, Wi-Fi has become the femtocell and with all the data offload is what I'm referring to. But I do think that the idea that the carriers could start using 700 megahertz and, as they say, go through walls, I think that could be interesting. I mean, if you put a 700 megahertz device in a home, for example, you would get better propagation. And, you know, I'm not a radio expert, but I think you'd get better propagation than you would using Wi-Fi through the walls, even in a home. And that's where a femtocell might fall short. So, so it is a good idea, Carl.
Cool. So, in other words, from the home to the service provider, we've got a role for TV white space coming up here. So, no wonder we're calling it Super Wi-Fi. Cool.
There you go.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.